Thomas Reed was attempting to teach his coffee mug the fundamentals of gravitational theory when the hyperspace transmission arrived. The mug, being a particularly stubborn student, chose that precise moment to demonstrate Newton's laws by plummeting toward the floor of his cramped research station office. He lunged for it with the desperate grace of a man who hadn't seen proper Earth coffee in 6 months, only to freeze mid-dive as the communication array erupted in a symphony of lights that would have made a supernova jealous. "Well, that's not ominous at all," he muttered, watching his precious caffeine splatter across the metal floor in patterns that vaguely resembled the Horsehead Nebula. The transmission beacon pulsed with an authority that made his station's aging equipment whimper in submission. Thomas had seen military broadcasts, emergency alerts, even the occasional drunken message from his sister back on Mars colony, but nothing that carried this level of encrypted sophistication. The holographic seal materialized above his desk with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for bad space operas. Intricate geometric patterns wove themselves into existence, pulsing with bioluminescent threads that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his human brain was comfortable processing. At the center, elegant script appeared in both standard galactic and something that made his universal translator hiccup nervously. "Royal Seal of the Etherian Empire," his computer announced in its most pompous voice, the one it reserved for pronouncing Latin names of particularly pretentious alien bacteria. "Priority Alpha, quantum encryption level, oh my." Thomas blinked, hard, then blinked again for good measure. "Computer, run a diagnostic on your pattern recognition subroutines. I think you're having delusions of grandeur again." "Sir, I may be a Mark VII AI with an unfortunate tendency toward sarcasm, but my pattern recognition is functioning within normal parameters. This is indeed a transmission from the Etherian Empire, specifically from—" The computer paused, its processing lights flickering in what Thomas had learned to recognize as digital confusion. "From Queen Lyrale of Etheros." The name hit him like a malfunctioning gravity generator. Lyra. Sweet, strange little Lyra with her impossibly long ears and eyes that held starlight. Lyra, who used to sit beside him during those endless summer afternoons on New Eden, explaining the theoretical physics of faster-than-light travel while he struggled with basic algebra. Lyra, who claimed her people came from a place where music could bend space and time grew like flowers in carefully tended gardens. "Sir." His computer ventured, probably detecting the spike in his heart rate. "Shall I decrypt the message?" Thomas nodded mutely, sinking into his chair as memories cascaded through his mind like a meteor shower. The refugee camp on New Eden hadn't been much to look at, a collection of prefabricated shelters huddled against the perpetual wind of the agricultural colony. His parents, being the kind of aggressively helpful humans that made their neighbors either grateful or exhausted, had volunteered to host some of the displaced families. Most of the refugees had been ordinary enough, traders whose roots had been disrupted by the war, colonists fleeing failed terraforming projects, the usual collection of galactic wanderers looking for a place to call home. But Lyra's family had been different. They spoke in harmonics that made the air shimmer, and their technology hummed with frequencies that made his teeth ache in a pleasant way. 8-year-old Thomas had been fascinated by Lyra's ears, so much longer and more pointed than human ears, decorated with tiny crystal formations that chimed softly when she moved her head. She'd caught him staring and laughed, a sound like silver bells caught in a solar wind. "They're neural interfaces," she'd explained with the patience of someone far older than her apparent years. "They help us hear the songs the universe sings." He'd spent 3 months convinced she was the most interesting person in known space, which, considering his previous experience had been limited to farmers and their occasionally philosophical livestock, wasn't saying much. But even now, 24 years later, and with a PhD in xenobiology under his belt, he still thought she might have been right. The message finished decrypting, and Queen Lyrale's face materialized in his office with startling clarity. She was older now, obviously, but those ears were unmistakable, elegant, and adorned with what appeared to be jewelry that pulsed with its own internal light. Her smile was the same, though, warm and slightly mischievous, as if she knew a joke the rest of the universe was still waiting to understand. "Hello, Thomas," she said, and her voice still carried those musical undertones that made his office's acoustic dampeners quiver in harmonious confusion. "I hope this message finds you well and not spilling coffee on important research, though knowing you, that's probably exactly what you were doing." He glanced at the brown stain spreading across his latest bacterial analysis and felt heat rise in his cheeks. 24 years, and she still knew him better than he knew himself. "I'm writing to invite you to my coronation," she continued, and the casual way she mentioned ruling an interstellar empire made his head spin. "I know it's been a while since we've spoken." "A while," Thomas snorted. "Try 2.5 decades and approximately 15 parsecs. But I've never forgotten our conversations by the Crystal Lake, or the promises we made under New Eden's 3 moons." Her expression grew softer, more vulnerable, particularly the one you made about marrying me when we grew up. Thomas's chair creaked ominously as he leaned back, staring at the hologram with the expression of a man who just realized his childhood games of make-believe had somehow become legally binding contracts. "Oh, come on. We were kids. I also promised to build you a spaceship out of my mother's garden shed and teach my pet rock to do quantum calculations. The invitation is attached, along with transportation arrangements," Lyreley continued as if she hadn't heard his protest, though the slight upturn of her lips suggested otherwise. "I do hope you'll come, Thomas. After all, a queen should keep her promises, don't you think? And I did promise to hold you to yours." The transmission ended, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts, his spilled coffee, and the growing suspicion that his quiet life of cataloging microorganisms on the galaxy's most boring research station was about to become significantly more complicated. His computer cleared its electronic throat. "Sir, shall I prepare a response declining the invitation? I could suggest a prior engagement with critical bacterial samples, or perhaps a sudden allergy to royal ceremonies." Thomas stared at the invitation floating above his desk, its elegant script promising diplomatic immunity, first-class hyperspace travel, and accommodations in what appeared to be a palace built from crystallized music. "Computer, what do you know about Etherian marriage customs?" "Searching. Oh dear. Sir, according to my databases, Etherian culture places tremendous importance on childhood promises. They believe such commitments are made with the purest intent, uncorrupted by adult cynicism or political calculation." "Of course they do." Thomas rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of what promised to be an epic headache. "And what happens if someone breaks such a promise?" "The records are unclear, but there are references to something called harmonic displacement, which sounds either deeply spiritual or mildly catastrophic, depending on one's perspective." Thomas looked at his reflection in his computer screen. A man whose greatest adventure in the past 5 years had been discovering a new strain of photosynthetic bacteria that could survive in low-gravity environments. His hair needed cutting, his beard needed trimming, and his social skills needed a complete overhaul if he was going to survive dinner with galactic royalty. "Computer, clear my schedule for the next month." "Sir, your schedule consists entirely of stare at bacterial cultures and try to remember to eat actual food." "I hardly think." "Just do it." Thomas stood, stepping carefully around the coffee puddle that was beginning to develop its own ecosystem. "And send a message to Queen Lyreley. Tell her I'll be there." After all, he reasoned as he began planning for what was either going to be the adventure of a lifetime or the most embarrassing diplomatic incident in human history. What was the worst that could happen? Besides accidentally starting an interstellar war, completely humiliating himself in front of an advanced civilization, or discovering that his childhood crush had grown up to become a terrifying space empress with the power to rearrange solar systems. Thomas Reed, xenobiologist and apparently reluctant participant in cosmic romance, when to pack his only clean shirt. The diplomatic transport's artificial gravity had apparently been calibrated by someone with a twisted sense of humor and a deep misunderstanding of human physiology. Thomas gripped his seat as the ship performed what the pilot cheerfully announced as a routine dimensional fold, which felt suspiciously like being turned inside out by a particularly vindictive universe. First time on an Etherian vessel? Asked his escort, Commander Zephyr, whose pointed ears twitched with what Thomas was beginning to recognize as barely suppressed amusement. The commander had introduced himself as Lyralay's personal guard, though his casual demeanor and tendency to make jokes about Thomas's obvious terror suggested he took a rather relaxed approach to royal protection duty. First time on any vessel that treats the laws of physics as helpful suggestions, Thomas managed, trying not to look at the viewport where space was doing things that would make Einstein weep. Stars stretched into luminous ribbons, while what appeared to be a small nebula folded itself into origami patterns just outside the window. Zephyr chuckled, his ears flickering with bioluminescent patterns that Thomas's universal translator helpfully identified as polite mockery. Wait until you see the Capitol. We built it during our experimental phase, back when we thought architecture should be more of a collaborative effort between artists and theoretical physicists. The transition back to normal space happened with all the subtlety of being punched by a rainbow. One moment they were sailing through a kaleidoscope of twisted spacetime. The next they were approaching what Thomas could only describe as the universe's most beautiful mistake. The capital city of Etheros sprawled across 3 interconnected planetoids, connected by bridges of pure energy that hummed with harmonics his bones could feel. Crystalline spires grew from the surface like impossible flowers, their surfaces reflecting light that existed in colors Thomas was pretty sure weren't supposed to be visible to human eyes. The founding council got a bit carried away, Zephyr admitted, noting Thomas's slack-jawed expression. They wanted to create something that would demonstrate our mastery over matter and energy. What they actually created was something that makes visitors question their grip on reality. We get a lot of very confused tourists. Thomas pressed his face to the viewport like a child seeing snow for the first time. Floating gardens drifted between the spires, their plants swaying in manufactured breezes that followed musical scales rather than meteorological patterns. Transportation pods moved through the air in spiraling dances that somehow never resulted in collisions, their paths traced by streams of light that lingered long enough to create a constantly shifting web of luminous traffic. How do you keep track of where anything is? Thomas asked, watching a particularly large building phase in and out of visibility as they passed. Very carefully, Zephyr replied, and with lots of practice. The city's navigation system is tied to our neural interfaces. Without them, most of us would spend our lives wandering in circles, wondering why the grocery store keeps moving. The shuttle touched down on a landing pad that felt solid enough, but appeared to be made entirely of crystallized music. Thomas could see the notes frozen in the transparent surface, complex harmonies that would probably sound beautiful if someone figured out how to play a platform the size of a small building. Try not to think too hard about how any of this works, Zephyr advised as they disembarked. We've had visitors give themselves migraines trying to apply their home physics to our architecture. Reality is much more flexible than most species assume. The air tasted of ozone and honey, with an underlying current of something that made Thomas's neurons tingle pleasantly. Etherian citizens moved through the streets with a grace that suggested they were perpetually dancing to music only they could hear. Their elongated ears adorned with jewelry that chimed in harmony with their movements. Children played games that involved manipulating small holographic shapes, their laughter creating visible ripples in the air that dissipated in showers of golden sparks. The coronation begins in 2 hours, Zephyr explained as they walked through streets that seemed to rearrange themselves to provide the most scenic route. Standard galactic ceremony, with a few traditional Etherian elements. Try not to stare when Queen Lyralay bonds with the crown resonance. It tends to make the uninitiated nervous. The crown resonance, ancient artifact that connects the ruler to the collective harmony of our people. Very impressive, completely safe, and only occasionally results in minor temporal displacement. Zephyr's ears flickered with patterns Thomas was learning to recognize as deadpan humor. I'm joking about the temporal displacement. Mostly. They entered what Zephyr called the ceremonial plaza, though it looked more like the inside of a crystal cathedral, designed by someone who had strong opinions about the relationship between mathematics and beauty. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled seats that grew from the floor like geometric mushrooms. Thomas spotted delegates from the Terran Federation, their crisp uniforms looking almost aggressively practical amid the flowing robes and bioluminescent accessories of other species. Where exactly should I? Thomas began, then stopped as a hush fell over the enormous space. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as figures began processing toward the central dais. Etherian nobles moved in perfect synchronization, their steps creating harmonies that made the crystal walls resonate with increasingly complex melodies. Then Lyrale appeared, and Thomas forgot how to breathe properly. She wore robes that captured light and held it prisoner, releasing it in slow waves that painted aurora patterns across her skin. Her ears, now elegantly pointed and adorned with neural interface jewelry that pulsed with soft bioluminescence, marked her unmistakably as Etherian royalty. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart, the same warm, intelligent eyes he remembered, though now they held depths that spoke of responsibilities he couldn't begin to imagine. The crown materialized above her head as she reached the dais, a construction of crystallized time that bent light around itself in ways that made Thomas's vision blur if he looked directly at it. As it settled onto her brow, Lyrale's entire being seemed to resonate with frequencies that made the assembled crowd sway in unconscious harmony. By the ancient songs and the new silence, she spoke, her voice carrying across the plaza without technological amplification, I accept the harmony of rule and the discord of choice. Let the stars witness that I will guide our people not as a distant melody, but as part of the greater symphony. The crowd responded with a sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language, but somehow conveyed approval, joy, and a deep sense of rightness that made Thomas's chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. Lyrale's gaze swept across the assembly, and when her eyes found his, 24 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. She smiled, the same slightly crooked smile he remembered from an 8-year-old girl who had patiently explained why his homemade rocket couldn't achieve escape velocity, and raised one hand in a gesture that was somehow both regal acknowledgement and intimate greeting. And now, she announced, her voice carrying a note of mischief that made several courtiers exchange worried glances, I have a personal matter to address. Thomas Reed of the Terran Federation, would you please join me? Thomas felt approximately 17,000 pairs of eyes turn toward him with the collective weight of a small star. His legs, apparently deciding this was an excellent time to stage a revolt, refused to move. Zephyr, still grinning with those infuriating bioluminescent patterns, gave him a gentle push toward the dais. This is the part where you walk, Zephyr whispered helpfully. Try not to trip. It's considered poor form to fall on one's face during royal ceremonies. Thomas somehow managed to navigate the crystalline steps without embarrassing his entire species. Up close, Lyrale was even more overwhelming, power and grace, and an underlying warmth that reminded him of summer afternoons and shared secrets. She extended her hand, and when he took it, he felt the slight hum of her neural interfaces and remembered the girl who had once claimed she could hear the music between the stars. Hello, Thomas, she said softly for his ears alone. Thank you for coming. I wasn't entirely sure you would. I'm not entirely sure I had a choice, he replied, then immediately regretted it when her smile widened. Oh, you always have a choice. That's what makes this interesting. She turned to address the crowd but didn't release his hand. My friends, allow me to present Thomas Reed, xenobiologist, childhood friend, and the man who once promised to marry me when we grew up. The plaza erupted in what Thomas sincerely hoped was approving chatter, though for all he knew, they could be debating whether humans were intelligent enough to participate in royal ceremonies, or just planning the most diplomatic way to launch him into the nearest sun. Lyreley leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "Don't look so terrified. I promise this will be much more fun than cataloging bacteria on a research station." Thomas looked into her eyes, saw the girl he'd known overlaid with the woman she'd become, and realized with growing horror and excitement that his quiet life had just become infinitely more complicated. "I don't suppose," he whispered back, "there's any chance this is all an elaborate practical joke." Her laughter created visible ripples in the air around them, golden and bright and completely, utterly musical. "Oh, Thomas, this is just the beginning." The royal gardens existed in a state of controlled impossibility that made Thomas's scientific training whimper and hide in a corner. Flowers bloomed in mathematical spirals that told stories when viewed from the correct angle, their petals shifting through color spectrums that included shades his retinas were definitely not evolved to process. Lyreley walked beside him along paths that curved through dimensions he couldn't quite see, her crown replaced by a simple circlet that hummed softly with residual coronation energy. "I've been practicing this conversation for months," she admitted, pausing beside a fountain that defied gravity by flowing upward in helical patterns before crystallizing into temporary sculptures. 17 different scenarios, actually. In none of them did you look quite so much like you were about to faint. Thomas sat heavily on a bench that adjusted its molecular structure to provide optimal comfort, which somehow made him even more nervous. "In my defense, being publicly announced as your future husband wasn't exactly covered in my diplomatic training, which, I should mention, consisted entirely of a 3-hour seminar on not insulting alien dignitaries by accident." "Did you learn anything useful?" Lyreley settled beside him, and Thomas caught the scent of something like jasmine mixed with ozone and the faintest hint of starlight. "Apparently, never comment on anyone's mating displays, avoid discussions of local cuisine unless you're prepared to eat it, and always compliment the quantum resonance of their ceremonial architecture." He gestured at the garden around them. "Though I'm not sure that last one applies when the architecture is actively trying to achieve sentience." Lyreley's laughter made nearby flowers chime in harmony. "The gardens are only semi-sentient. They mostly just eavesdrop on conversations and gossip with the palace AI. It's surprisingly effective for security purposes." "Wonderful. So when I inevitably say something diplomatically catastrophic, it'll be preserved forever in your botanical surveillance network." "Thomas." Her voice carried those musical undertones that made his nervous system vibrate in pleasant confusion. "Do you remember what we talked about during those summer evenings on New Eden? Really talked about, I mean, not just the silly promises children make." He closed his eyes, letting the memories surface. Long afternoons by the crystal lake, Lyra explaining concepts that wouldn't be discovered by human science for another decade. Her family's apparent exile, which she described as a temporary relocation due to political complexity. The way she'd listened to the harmonic theory of cosmic consciousness. Her ears flickered with bioluminescent patterns he recognized as pride mixed with something deeper. Most galactic civilizations dismiss it as primitive mysticism, but you asked questions. Real questions, not just polite academic interest. "I was 8 years old. I asked questions about everything, including why my pet rock wouldn't learn multiplication tables." "You asked why harmony requires discord to exist, why beautiful music needs the possibility of silence to have meaning." She turned to face him fully, and he saw vulnerability beneath her royal composure. "Do you know what my council thinks of this proposed marriage alliance?" Thomas felt his stomach perform a complex maneuver that violated several conservation laws. "I'm afraid to ask. Half of them think it's brilliant political theater, a demonstration that Etherian royalty values genuine connection over calculated advantage. The other half think humans are barely evolved primates who haven't even mastered basic telepathic communication yet. Her smile turned wicked. Counselor Harmony, yes, that's actually his name, suggested we'd be better off negotiating with your dolphins. Our dolphins are actually quite intelligent, Thomas protested. They just have strong opinions about human foreign policy. That's what I told him. Unfortunately, he took it as confirmation of his theory. They sat in comfortable silence while the garden rearranged itself around them, providing privacy by growing a temporary alcove of crystalline vines that hummed with white noise frequencies. Thomas watched Lyralay's profile, noting how the girl he'd known was still there in the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when thinking deeply. "What do you want, Lyra?" he asked finally. Not Queen Lyralay with her political responsibilities and cosmic harmonies. What do you actually want? She was quiet for so long he wondered if he'd crossed some invisible line of royal protocol. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than he'd heard since their reunion. "I want to show you something." She stood, extending her hand. "Something I've never shown anyone else." They walked deeper into the gardens, past sections where plants grew in zero gravity and flowers that existed in quantum superposition until observed. Eventually, they reached a hidden grove where ordinary earth plants grew in neat, familiar rows. Thomas recognized tomatoes, sunflowers, and what appeared to be his mother's prized roses, though these versions glowed softly with their own internal light. "You kept them," he breathed, remembering the handful of seeds his family had given her as a farewell gift. "I've been cultivating them for 24 years, crossbreeding them with Etherian flora, teaching them to harmonize with our soil frequency." She knelt beside a patch of what looked like enhanced strawberries. It started as homesickness, but it became something else. A bridge between worlds, maybe. Thomas knelt beside her, examining plants that shouldn't exist but clearly thrived in the impossible conditions of an alien garden. "This is incredible. The cellular adaptations alone would revolutionize terraforming technology." "Always the scientist," she teased, but her tone was fond. "Though you're not wrong. My agricultural advisors are quite excited about the implications." "Is that what this is about? Agricultural cooperation agreements disguised as royal marriages?" "Thomas." She caught his hands, her touch warm and electric with neural interface energy. "Do you really think I'd summon you across the galaxy for farming contracts?" He looked into her eyes and saw the same depth that had fascinated him as a child, but now overlaid with the complexity of someone who'd learned to balance personal desires against the needs of billions. "I think you'd do whatever you believed was best for your people, even if it meant breaking your own heart. And I think you'd sacrifice your own happiness rather than risk someone else's well-being, even if that someone happens to be the girl you promised to marry when you were too young to understand what promises really cost." They stared at each other across the small space between them. 24 years of separation and the weight of two civilizations creating a tension that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the simple, terrifying possibility that childhood dreams might actually come true. "My council expects an answer within the lunar cycle," Lyralay said softly. "The marriage would be more than symbolic. Joint research initiatives, cultural exchange programs, a demonstration that species evolution doesn't require losing connection to our origins." "And if I say no?" "Then you say no. I told you, Thomas, you always have a choice. That's what makes free will so beautifully terrifying." He thought about his quiet research station, his bacterial cultures, his carefully ordered life of scientific routine. Then he looked at the woman beside him, who'd grown from a strange, wonderful child into someone who could reshape the political landscape of known space, but still tended a secret garden of earth plants, because they reminded her of summer afternoons and shared dreams. "Can I ask you something that might be incredibly inappropriate?" Her ears flickered with amusement patterns. "Given that we're discussing marriage based on a childhood promise, I think we're well past appropriate. Are you happy? Really happy? Not just successfully fulfilling your royal obligations happy?" She considered this with the same careful attention she'd once given to explaining why faster-than-light travel required thinking in curves instead of straight lines. I'm content, I'm useful, I'm making a difference for my people. That's not what I asked. No, she admitted quietly. It's not. She looked up at Etheros' twin suns, their light creating complex interference patterns in the garden's crystal formations. I've been queen for exactly 6 hours, and I already miss being just Lyra, the girl who could spend afternoons talking about impossible things with her favorite human. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with childhood memories and everything to do with the woman sitting beside him in a garden that shouldn't exist, tending plants that proved love could transcend the vast distances between stars. What if we tried something completely unprecedented, he suggested, such as, what if we started with friendship and worked our way up to cosmic diplomacy? Got to know each other as adults before deciding whether childhood promises are worth keeping. Lyralay's smile was radiant enough to power a small space station. Thomas Reed, that might be the most sensible thing anyone said to me since my coronation. Don't get used to it. I'm much better at accidentally starting interstellar incidents. Perfect, she laughed, her joy creating visible ripples in the air around them. I was getting bored with conventional diplomacy anyway. The emergency council session convened at what Thomas's circadian rhythms insisted was 3 in the morning, though Etheros' twin suns made determining actual time feel like a philosophical exercise. He sat in what Zephyr had cheerfully called the hot seat, a chair that literally adjusted its temperature based on the occupant's stress levels, and was currently approaching the thermal output of a small furnace. The human hesitates because his species lacks the neural capacity for commitment, Counselor Harmony declared, his elongated ears practically vibrating with indignation. This delay proves they cannot be trusted with matters of galactic significance. Actually, Thomas interjected, raising his hand like a particularly nervous student, I hesitate because marrying someone I haven't seen in 24 years seemed like it might require some discussion. Call it a quirk of human psychology. Lyralay, resplendent in formal robes that seemed to be woven from crystallized authority, caught his eye and winked. The gesture was so perfectly timed that Thomas nearly choked on his attempt to maintain diplomatic composure. The Terran Federation's preliminary response has been interesting, announced Counselor Melody, consulting a holographic display that showed what appeared to be several very confused human diplomats. They seem to believe this is either an elaborate hoax or evidence that their xenobiologist has suffered some form of neural breakdown. That's fair, Thomas admitted. If someone told me last week that I'd be debating interstellar marriage policy with a council of musical aliens, I'd have recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation. But we are not musical, Harmony protested. We simply exist in harmonic resonance with the fundamental frequencies of. You're totally musical, Thomas interrupted, then immediately wondered if contradicting an alien counselor was grounds for diplomatic immunity revocation. I mean, with respect, your entire civilization is built around acoustic principles. Your architecture hums, your transportation system plays melodies, and your queen's crown is basically a cosmic tuning fork. Lyralay's suppressed laughter created barely visible sound waves in the chamber's acoustically sensitive atmosphere. He has a point, Counselor. We are rather musical. The debate had been raging for 3 hours, ever since news broke that a faction of young Etherian nobles had begun circulating propaganda about human unreliability. Their evidence consisted primarily of Thomas's failure to immediately accept the marriage proposal, which they claimed demonstrated that humans viewed promises as convenient suggestions rather than binding agreements. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Rhythm, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's crystal walls resonate sympathetically, we should consider why the human's caution might actually indicate wisdom rather than weakness. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly counselor, whose neural interface jewelry chimed with patterns he was learning to recognize as thoughtful consideration. Wisdom. Harmony's ears flickered with bioluminescent skepticism. He cannot even maintain proper harmonic frequency during formal discussions. That's because humans don't have neural interfaces, Thomas explained patiently. We communicate through crude acoustic vibrations and facial expressions. It's primitive, but it got us to space eventually. Barely, muttered someone from the back of the council chamber. Lyreley stood, her movement creating a wave of respectful silence that rippled through the assembled counselors. My friends, we seem to be missing the larger point. Thomas's presence here, his willingness to travel across the galaxy based on a childhood memory, demonstrates exactly the kind of authentic connection our alliance needs. But the marriage, Harmony began, will happen when and if we both decide it should, Lyra interrupted firmly. Not because political expediency demands it, and not because ancient customs require it. Because two people who knew each other as children have chosen to explore what they might mean to each other as adults. Thomas felt his heart perform several complex maneuvers that definitely violated conservation of energy. The woman who had once patiently explained theoretical physics to an 8-year-old was now defending his right to make his own choices in front of an interstellar governing body. And somehow that meant more than all the royal proclamations in the galaxy. I have a proposal, he said, standing up before his courage could desert him entirely. Something that might satisfy both political necessity and personal preference. The council chamber fell silent except for the ambient harmonics of the building's structural resonance. Thomas cleared his throat and tried to remember every diplomatic protocol he'd hastily studied during the hyperspace journey. Queen Lyreley mentioned joint research initiatives. What if we started there? A formal collaboration between human xenobiology and Etherian harmonic sciences. I spend 6 months here, learning your methods. She spends 6 months on human worlds, experiencing our approach to scientific inquiry. We work together on projects that benefit both civilizations. And the marriage question? Melody asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than political maneuvering. Gets answered by two people who have had time to rediscover each other without the pressure of immediate political consequences, Thomas replied. If we decide we're compatible as partners, then we have a foundation built on adult choice rather than childhood promises. If we decide we're better as friends and research colleagues, then both our peoples benefit from the scientific collaboration. Lyreley's smile could have powered the city's entire transportation grid. Thomas Reed, that might be the most diplomatically elegant solution anyone's proposed since my coronation. Don't sound so surprised. I do have a doctorate, even if it's just in bacterial behavior. Bacterial behavior is highly underrated, she replied seriously. Some of our most successful urban planning initiatives were inspired by colony organism studies. Counselor Rhythm's jewelry chimed with what Thomas recognized as approval. A courtship through collaboration. It has precedent in our oldest traditions, and it allows for the possibility of genuine affection to develop naturally. Or genuine incompatibility to become obvious before anyone signs irreversible treaties, Thomas added helpfully. Harmony looked like he'd swallowed something that disagreed with his harmonic frequency, but even he couldn't argue with the proposal's practical advantages. The research collaboration would demonstrate Etherian willingness to share advanced knowledge with developing civilizations. Hey now, Thomas protested. We're not that developing. We've got faster-than-light travel and everything. You've got crude hyperdrive technology and a tendency to solve problems by applying more energy until something explodes, Melody corrected gently. It's charmingly direct, but hardly sophisticated. Fair point, Thomas conceded. Though in our defense, the explosion approach works more often than you'd expect. The vote was unanimous, though Harmony's agreement came with enough harmonic discord to make the chamber's acoustic dampeners work overtime. Thomas found himself appointed as the Terran Federation's first xenobiological cultural exchange representative, a title that sounded impressive enough to justify the bureaucratic nightmare this was going to create for his former research station supervisor. Later, as Etheros' twin sons set in patterns that painted the sky in colors that didn't exist in human language, Thomas and Lyrale walked through her private garden among the hybrid earth plants that had somehow learned to sing softly in the evening breeze. "No pressure," she said, her tone carefully light. "But I should mention that our agricultural science division is extremely interested in your insights on cross-species plant adaptation. And I should mention that human xenobiology would probably declare you a scientific miracle if they knew about your neural interface capabilities," Thomas replied. "The biotechnology implications alone could revolutionize medical treatment. So we're both scientifically fascinating to each other. That's a promising start." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Lyra, are you sure about this? I mean, really sure. You're a queen with the power to reshape galactic politics, and I'm a guy who talks to bacteria for a living." "Thomas," her voice carried those musical undertones that made his entire nervous system hum in harmony. "Do you know what I missed most about our friendship? My stunning intellect and natural diplomatic grace. Your ability to make me laugh at myself. To remember that being powerful doesn't mean being perfect, and that the most important discoveries often come from the most unexpected connections." She reached for his hands, her touch warm with neural interface energy. "Besides, bacteria are fascinating. They've mastered interspecies communication, adaptive evolution, and sustainable community building. Maybe we could learn something from them." Thomas looked into her eyes and saw the same curiosity and wonder that had captivated him as a child, now deepened by wisdom and responsibility, but still fundamentally, recognizably her. "So we're really doing this. 6 months of scientific collaboration and carefully supervised romantic potential. We're really doing this." Her smile was radiant enough to make the hybrid flowers chime in harmony. "Though I should warn you, Etherian research methods can be intense. More intense than accidentally starting an interstellar diplomatic incident by spilling coffee on royal correspondence. Oh, much more intense than that. We might actually have to work together every day, share ideas, debate methodology, and gradually discover whether childhood promises can grow into adult partnerships." Thomas grinned, feeling lighter than he had since receiving her initial transmission. "Lyrale, queen of Etheros and apparently master of terrifying romantic prospects, I accept your research proposal." "Excellent. We start tomorrow with harmonic resonance theory and its applications to bacterial colony behavior." "Wait, seriously? Thomas, did you really think I'd invite you across the galaxy without having a specific project in mind? Your work on bacterial communication networks could revolutionize how we understand planetary ecosystem management." He stared at her for a moment, then burst into laughter that made the garden's crystalline structures ring like bells. The girl who had once explained the theoretical physics of faster-than-light travel was now planning to combine his bacterial research with her people's cosmic harmony theories. And somehow that seemed like exactly the kind of impossible, wonderful project that might just change the galaxy. "In that case," Thomas said, offering her his arm as they walked back toward the palace whose architecture hummed with mathematics and music, "let's go discover what happens when bacterial colonies learn to sing." Above them, the stars wheeled in patterns that suggested stories yet to be written, and for the first time since leaving his quiet research station, Thomas Reed felt like he was exactly where he belonged,